A Croft in the Hills by Katharine Stewart. To my family, all of you with little children, take them somehow into the country among green grass and yellow wheat, among trees, by hills and streams, if you wish their highest education, that of the heart and the soul, to be completed. Richard Jefferies. Introduction to the first edition. Why, you may ask, record the simple fact that 3 people took to the hills and lived quiet lives under a wide sky, among the rock and heather, working with the crops and beasts they could manage to raise there in order to feed and clothe themselves. There is certainly little room for dramatic highlights in this story of ours, but we heard the singing and we found the gold. And I believe that each small stand taken against the shrill wind of disenchantment which is blowing across the world has more positive human value than many of the assertions being made by science today. Science says, here is a stone, it weighs so much, it measures so much, it is so and so many years old. But a man needs to discover that the stone is strong so that he can stand on it, and cool so that he can lay his head against it, that it is beautiful and can be fashioned as an ornament, or hard and can be built into his home. How does he make these discoveries? With his own eyes, his own wit, his own imagination. His assessment of the stone includes the measuring of his own stature, and as his hand passes over the firm surface, his brain is alert, his imagination lit. He is alive. If the human being is to hold to his identity, he must, somehow or other, keep on making his own discoveries. The tragedy of today is that it is becoming increasingly difficult for him to do so. He is even in danger of becoming a back number, for the powers that would govern his life have found that the machine is, for competitive purposes, so much more efficient and reliable than he is. When you have lived for a few years in the bare uplands, where life has been precarious from the start, you learn first not to panic. Then you are ready to love wholeheartedly what need no longer be feared. You become so deeply involved in the true drama of cherishing life itself that mere attitudes and the pursuit of possessions are discarded as absurd. You discover that under snow there is bread, the secret bread that sustains. Panic gone, you can plot a course with steady hand and eye, and after all, human steadfastness is the only ultimate weapon fit to guarantee survival in a real sense. That is why I thought it worthwhile to record the process by which 3 small human beings, completely re-enchanted with their world, found the strength to walk without fear among the astonishing beauty of its wilderness. I should like to thank Miss Anne Shorttread for capturing so delightfully in line the spirit of life in the uplands, and my special thanks go to Mr. Neil Gunn, who gave the book his blessing. Katharine Stewart. Foreword to the first edition by Neil M. Gunn. The typescript of this adventure story reached me out of the blue, or very nearly, for the Croft is about 1,000 feet above Loch Ness. Marginal land, hilltop farming, where on a February morning the blue may be vibrant with lark song, or obscured by a snow blizzard. This is the oldest of all Highland adventures, and will be the last. It is heartening and heartbreaking. Why do people go on thinking they can make a living out of the Hillcroft? In particular, what drives strangers not bred in crofting traditions to make the attempt? This is a story of such an attempt, with all the questions answered, and it is told so well that I find it absorbing. For the author and her husband see everything with new eyes. They meet their problems as they arise, and they arise daily. Their capacity for work is all but inexhaustible. If I hesitate to use the word heroic, it is because there are no heroics in this human record. Only day-to-day doings, the facts of life, but again, facts that spread over into many dimensions, the extra dimensions that give the book its unusual quality, its brightness, and its wisdom. For the attitude to life is positive. It somehow contrives to suffer the frustrations, and that today is rare. Often, too, this is seen in colored threads running through the main texture, as in the growing up of their child to school age and her responses to the myriad influences of the natural scene, or in the spontaneous help given by and to neighbors at difficult and crucial times, the old communal warmth that survives the hazards, or is there because of them. I commend this book to all those who are interested in such things, and may have sometimes wondered if there is any meaning in the ancient notion of a way of life. Foreword to the second edition by Iona MacNicol. It is a great honor for me to be asked to introduce this reprint of A Croft in the Hills. The book gave me great delight when it first appeared. I treasure my copy. I am happy that now many more readers may enjoy it. I am myself of the old stock of Abrichen, the place which the author chose for her brave venture into crofting life. I have therefore the keener interest in it, but I know that through this book and through the folk museum with which she has more recently been associated, Katharine Stewart has illuminated the crofting life not only of Abrichen, but of the Highlands of Scotland. Chapter 1. Divine Discontent. We had both, since our earliest days, found it difficult to live in a city. Every free half-day or weekend, every summer holiday, had found us making for the nearest patch of country, anywhere we could breathe and smell the earth and see the sky in great stretches, instead of in tiny squares between the huddled rooftops. I shall always remember walking down Oxford Street during a wartime rush hour, and finding myself nearly losing my footing among the crowd because my mind's eye was fixed on the rim of a steel-blue Highland loch, and I was smelling the scent of the bog myrtle and hearing the weird lonely cry of a drifting curlew. Jim at the time used to stand, during the brief spells of leisure his excavating job afforded, gazing through the huge plate-glass windows of his place of work and seeing beyond the racketed crowd an oasis very like the one I had wandered into. Later we managed to make some sort of compromise. We lived on the edge of the country, and he went off to work at an unearthly hour of the morning, clad in the respectable black coat and hat of the city worker, and shod with large, hobnailed boots, which he changed on arrival, for the 2-mile walk to the bus. In the evening I would go to meet him, and in still weather I would hear the ring of the hobnails on the road long before he came in sight. We had a garden. We had trees, the sky in stretches. We grew vegetables. We kept bees and hens and ducks. But the journeys to and from work were exhausting, though Jim would never admit it, and compromises are never really satisfactory. We were chafing against the tether. Then Jim's work took him to a small town in the north of Scotland. That was the end. City life is bad enough, but small town life is far worse. In a city one has, at least, the feeling that there are thousands of kindred spirits about if one only knew them, folk just as dissatisfied as oneself with the mechanics of living, who know that it is not enough to have acquired some little skill or other, which will enable one to make enough money to buy shelter and clothing and food, so that one may continue to employ one's skill so as to be able to go on buying shelter and clothing and food and so on ad infinitum. In the city, there is at least a spark of divine discontent, and only half-submerged longing to catch a glimpse of the larger design. But in a small town, everyone seems so glad of the boundary wall. By this time, our daughter Helen was growing into a sturdy youngster. As I wandered hand in hand with her, back from the shops and along the row of trim villas to our home, I found my mind straying, as it had done years before in London, to some imagined remoteness. I pictured Helen splashing in a hill burn in summer, rolling like a young sheltie in the snow in winter, racing the wind on the moor, gazing at birds and minute creatures among the grasses. Sheer nonsense. A small nagging voice would hiss in my ear. A child needs all the amenities of town life, a good school, and lessons in music and dancing and all the other benefits civilization has to offer. Without them, she'll only grow into a helpless misfit. But would she? Wouldn't it be better for her to have at least a glimpse of the roots of things, not allow her to accept life as she would a shining parcel neatly wrapped in cellophane? Wouldn't close contact with natural things give her a perspective and poise she would never lose? I firmly believed it would. Jim worked long hours. Sometimes it was late evening before he reached home, and we would have to leave again in the morning without getting more than a glimpse of Helen. We both knew that it was only half a life we were living. We had bought, very cheaply, because it was in an appalling state of neglect, a house in a good residential district of the town. We had done it up and found that light paintwork everywhere and the installation of electricity and some additional plumbing transformed it into quite a pleasant place. We tackled the wilderness of a garden and cleared a plot for vegetables. There would be room to keep some hens and even a goat, we decided. We'd be able to unearth the beehives we had bought from our southern garden, and there were some derelict stable buildings where we thought we could perhaps grow mushrooms. But there might be objections from authorities. We still felt hemmed in, particularly as we knew that our outdoor activities were discreetly observed from behind impeccable net curtains by our distinctly circumvent neighbors. There was no doubt about it. We were getting restless again. We began to scan the columns of various newspapers under jobs, houses, jobs. Could we get some sort of a joint post, which would allow us to live in open country with security? We made one or two abortive attempts in this direction, and also inspected several small holdings on the outskirts of the town. Then we saw it, an advertisement for a 7-roomed house in a place with an exceedingly unfamiliar name, with 40 acres of arable land and an outrun on the moor, for the comparatively small sum of £500. We got out the map, found the spot, and repeated the name out loud, looking wonderingly at each other. Music was sounding in our ears. Instantly, our minds were made up. It was within quite easy reach. We must see it, just see it, at least. On Jim's next free day, we got out our old van, packed a picnic, opened the map, and set off. Through Inverness we went, and along the shores of Loch Ness to a point about halfway to Drumnadrochit. There a small road branched off from the main one. There was no signpost, just this rough-shod track pointing skyward. This is it. We beamed at each other and put the van sharply at the rise. We climbed slowly, changing gear every few yards, one eye on the panorama spread out below us, the other on what might emerge around the next corner ahead. After about a mile of this tortuous mounting, we found ourselves on more or less level ground. Hills rose steep on either side. There were small fields carved out of the encroaching heather. Croft houses were dotted here and there. There was a school, a tiny post office, and a telephone kiosk. We made inquiries and found we had another mile or so to go. We came within sight of a small loch, lapping the foot of a shapely hill. It was remarkably like the Oxford Street oasis. We branched right at this point, and the landscape opened out into great distances. Another half-mile, and we left the van at the roadside and took, as directed, the footpath through a patch of felled woodland. Then at last the roof and chimneys of a dwelling came into view. We stopped at a stile and took a long look at it. 4 square, very solid it stood, facing just to the east of south, its walls of rough granite and whinstone, its roof of fine blue slate. Beyond was the steading, in front a line of rowan trees, sure protection against evil spirits according to Highland lore. A patch of rough grass all round the house was enclosed by a stout netted fence, and on either side of the door was a small flower bed. Round the house and steading was arable land, and beyond that the moor, rising to the hill land and to farther and farther hills against the horizon. It was May, and the warmth of the sun was bringing out the scent of the first heath flowers. A small soft wind out of the west blew on our hands and faces. A bee hummed through the springing grass at our feet. The flanks of the farthest hill were swathed in blue mist. We saw the good lady of the house. She pointed out the boundaries, and we talked of the various possibilities of obtaining a pumped water supply. The only well was a good 150 yards away and below the level of the house, but she had a diviner out, and her son had started to dig for water at a spot indicated by him, within a stone's throw of the house. We gazed hopefully into this chasm and agreed that it would be all too good if the water could be found there. The house was in excellent state of repair. Over the lintel was carved the date 1911. We learnt later that the house was actually built in 1910, but as the mason found it easier to make a 1 than a 0, he engraved the date 1911. We also learnt later that in former times practically every crofter had a trade at his fingertips, which he practiced alongside the workings of his croft. This house, like nearly all those in the district, had been slated by the man who was to become our nearest and very dear neighbor. Downstairs were 2 good-sized rooms, one stone-floored, the other with a new floor of wood. The stone-floored room had originally been the kitchen, but as the cooking was now done in a built-on scullery, the range had been removed. the original wide hearth restored, and a most attractive chimney piece of rough local stone built round it. Off this room was a small bedroom and a door leading to the substantial scullery. Upstairs were 2 good bedrooms and a box room with a skylight. Our experience with our new townhouse had taught us what points to look for in examining property. The walls and woodwork were shabby, but the structure was sound and weatherproof. It was the sort of house you could start to live in right away. The steading was of the usual Highland design, a long, low building divided into 3 parts, byre, stable, and barn, with thick stone walls and a roof of corrugated iron, and like the house, it was in excellent repair. Beyond it were the ruins of the Black House, a small stone cottage thatched with heather, its walls blackened with peat reek, which had been the original dwelling in the holding. Opposite the steading, in the shelter of 4 giant rowans, was a small wooden henhouse. The fields had been cultivated only spasmodically over the last years, but they had a healthy slope to them, and we knew that it was possible to obtain grants and subsidies for plowing up and fertilizing such marginal land as this. Only a small area in the one level of arable ground was really damp and choked with rushes. We reckoned that a good clearing out and a repairing of drains would help there. The rough grazing gave promise of a good summer bite for sheep and hardy cattle. The fencing was patchy, to say the least of it, but we had already noticed on our way through the felled woodland the quality of quite sound wood that was lying about. Some of it would surely be fit to make into fencing posts, and we knew of an excellent scrapyard in Inverness where wire could be picked up very cheaply. The access road for vehicles was shared by our 2 immediate neighbours to the east. In Scotland, as nearly all the glens run roughly east and west, one always goes east or goes west when visiting neighbours. We could see that deliveries of heavy goods would have to be made during the drier months, as the road surface was distinctly soft, but it seemed to have a reasonably hard bottom, and livestock could be loaded at a bank at the side of the main road. The only thing that did really worry us a little was the lack of shelter. The woodland, which had formerly broken the force of the wind from all the southerly points of the compass, had been felled during and after the war. The view from the scullery window at the back was superb, but there seemed to be little but the heaty air between us and Ben Lyvis, which lay like a great dozing hound away to the north. But it was Maytime, and one of May's most glorious efforts in the way of a day, warm and sweet-scented and domed with milky blue. It is difficult on such a day really to visualize the storm and stress of winter. We walked to the limit of the little property and stood looking down the strath. Several small white croft houses stood on either side of the burn, flowing down its center. The fields adjoining them looked tidy and well cultivated. Plumes of smoke rose from squat chimneys. Here and there were the ruins of former houses where one holding had been incorporated into another. There was, on the whole, a feeling of quiet snugness about the prospect. It seemed incredible that we were standing nearly 1,000 feet above sea level. Probably an upland area such as this would never have been settled at all had it not been for the clearances of the 18th and 19th century. One certainly shudders to think of the labor that must have gone into the wrestling of the small fields from the bog and heather. The dry stone dikes remain as memorials to those who heaved the mighty stones out of the plow's way and made the crops sheep and cattle proof. The crofters' tenacity and innate gift for husbandry had resulted in their being able to maintain their families in health and in these surroundings. Could we, who had so little experience, reasonably hope to do the same? We had health and strength and a tremendous appetite for this kind of life. We each had close links with the soil. There were government schemes of assistance undreamt of by the older generations of crofters, and we could realize a certain amount of capital. We were braced and eager to take the leap. With Helen staggering ahead of us, a bunch of small bright heath flowers in her hand, we made our way back to the house. I think the lady in possession must have read the fate in our faces. She gave us tea, and we told her, as sups to our conscience, that we would think it over and let her know our decision in a day or two. Quietly and methodically, she told us that there was a postal delivery every day, and that an all-purpose van called every Wednesday and another on Saturday, but that, as it was often the early hours of Sunday before this latter one arrived, she preferred to deal with the Wednesday one. Small parcels of meat and fish, she said, could be sent through the post. We made a mental note of all the information she gave us, thanked her, and walked slowly back to the road. We did have a look at another place on the way home, but it was quite out of the question, twice the price, and very inaccessible, and as the French have it, said nothing to us. The house on the hill was already making its voice heard. All the way back in the van we listened in silence to what it had to say. It was a supremely honest little place. It hid nothing from us. Its fields had been neglected. Its access road was little more than a track. Its water supply was altogether unhandy. In winter it was liable to be cut off by impenetrable snowdrifts. But it offered a challenge. We had enough imagination to visualize its possibilities, and most of its impossibilities. Experience had taught us that the worst hardly ever happens, and if it does, it can usually be turned into a best. Our minds were seething with positive plans. All traces of discontent, however divine, had vanished utterly.